You are listening to the Breaktime Tech Talks podcast, a bite-sized tech podcast for busy developers, where we'll briefly cover technical topics, news snippets, and more in short time blocks. I'm your host, Jennifer Reif, an avid developer and problem solver with special interest in data, learning, and all things technology. This week unexpectedly brought me into MCP territory. I'd planned on investigating this path at some point, but I hadn't planned on doing it just yet. However, preparation for some upcoming events and other things going on ended up putting me on that path this week. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface, but it's a start. I also have a couple other tidbits from this week as well, so let me share what I've learned. To start off, a non-MCP related tidbit is that I found the holy grail of large language model uses, and that's flat file cleanup. So I ended up playing around with Claude a bit this week. I was hacking at a data set. I'd pulled down a JSON file, had been able to convert it over to CSV file, and was trying to clean up some of the text properties where there was a backslash inside the text. And it's notorious that you use something like a regex, so something like sed or awk or whatever, to do this. And I've played around with some of these tools before, and I always just feel like I'm throwing things at the wall and trying to see what works. And I end up either having to go back to a colleague or just hash it out for hours until I finally figure the solution out. But this round, I thought, you know what, why can't a large language model attempt this? And let's just see how well it does for something like this. So I showed Claude the file. I pulled up Claude code inside my folder with the flat file in it and said, hey, look at this file. See if you can escape the backslash characters that are inside this file to make sure that it will read properly. And it worked brilliantly. It escaped the backslash characters within the text field, and the file loaded to Neo4j on the first attempt after getting corrected by Claude. This was so much easier than searching around on the internet for the proper regex, sed versus awk versus something else, and testing on small subsets and slowly hashing through individual lines of a huge CSV file. That often in the past has taken me hours to go through, and pinging and bugging colleagues about it. I was able to do this pretty quickly and easily using Claude as an example, but you could use probably lots of other large language models as well. And it was so much easier. So I do recommend regex, which is a very consistent rule-based type of pattern matching. Works really well with flat files for that. Now, jumping into the MCP exploration this week. I was catching up on some YouTube videos that I hadn't seen, trying to dig into MCP, looking at demos for upcoming events and so on, and trying to figure out what I should do and what I should look into next. And I came across Jason Koo's YouTube video showing Claude Desktop and the Neo4j Cypher MCP integration. And that was a really good introductory video to get me started on this path. And then I thought, you know what, why can't I do that as part of a demo for working with Neo4j and Cypher and showcasing graphs a little bit? I started playing around with this and was able to get it spun up reasonably quickly. There were a couple of things that tripped me up. The first thing was that just looking at the GitHub documentation and some of the blog posts and videos out there, it wasn't super clear that I first needed to install UV or something similar. So I pulled that down. Once I pulled that in, then all of a sudden the configuration worked and I was able to connect from Claude code just fine. Now, I will also say that depending on the chat model, the chat interface or application that you're using, the configuration might need to be slightly different. It was pretty easy for me because I was using Claude, and the example I was looking at was also using Claude, so that was pretty straightforward. But you might need to alter your configuration because different large language models and chat interfaces will take slightly different formats on the JSON that is for the config. Now, my next step, now that I have just this introductory basic configuration between Claude Desktop and the Neo4j Cypher MCP server, my next step would be to integrate the MCP using Spring AI. I'm starting down that road a little bit just now, but I haven't gotten very far, so I'll keep you updated there. Now, I also, in this exploration with MCP and playing with Claude for flat file updating and so on, I came across one instance where the large language model was wrong and it dug in his heels and was somewhat passive aggressive on being wrong and saying that I was right. Here's the story. So I asked Claude to pull the most recent 3 reviews for some businesses, and it wrote cipher syntax that used a list range of 0 to 2. Which to most programmers' eyes looks right. Starting at an index of 0, ending on an index of 2, that's 3 indexes, right? 0, 1, and 2. However, cipher is actually exclusive of the end index, meaning that it pulls up to that index, but not that index. So therefore, it would pull 0 and 1 and not 2. Claude justified the response that some businesses only had fewer than 3 reviews, and that was why we were only seeing 2 reviews in the output results from that query. I thought, okay, no big deal. That looks right, but every business was pulling 2, and I did a quick count on the reviews per business and saw that there were tons more reviews than just 2. I went out to the cipher documentation, found, the list ranges actually are exclusive. And so I mentioned that to Claude, and Claude fixed the syntax, but the text response that it added to that syntax started by acknowledging I was correct, corrected the cipher to match my expectations and what would actually pull the results I was looking for. But then the following paragraph ended that in the cipher, 0 to 2 range returns indices 0, 1, 2, 3 elements. And 0 to 3 returns indices 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 elements, which is not correct because remember, it's exclusive. So it won't pull that last element. And that the previous query was working correctly and that some businesses only had fewer than 3 reviews. So it dug in its heels. It was being rather passive aggressive, the nerve, right, of a large language model. This is a good reminder that these AI systems are incredibly powerful, as I talked about with editing the flat file and going through and escaping those characters, and then doing some of these cipher queries by just prompting it with natural language, and then it uses the MCP server, creates these cipher queries, runs it against the database. That's really awesome. But it's also incredibly persuasive when it's wrong. If I hadn't known my cipher and cross-checked the documentation to back it up, I would have assumed that Claude was right and I was in the wrong. When people do these things, there's usually emotional consequence that follows. When you do something and you say something wrong, and then somebody executes and does something based on that information, there's usually some emotional consequence that goes along with you being wrong and telling somebody else that. There's some element of shame or guilt or admitting fault or legal consequences or something else. But the AI doesn't have this component. That's just the human element of when something goes wrong and when something goes bad. There's usually like a responsibility or accountability section. But how do you make a large language model, a system, accountable for these types of things? So this is an interesting conundrum that I think will continue to develop over time. And this was just the first instance that I have had of kind of this blatant dichotomy of you're right, but you're also wrong, and I'm right. I'm going to dig in my heels on this. Now, the other thing this week that I have kind of worked through is my colleague and I talked about the difficulty of finding and cleaning data sets to use for demos or applications or sample graphs or whatever. You end up with data that's in a variety of different formats, cleanliness, architectures, the model structure, and licensing states. So sometimes you'll end up with a data set that covers a lot of ground and does pretty well, but there's like an array or something in one of the fields and you need to kind of section that out, or the model that the files are in doesn't quite align to the data model that you're looking for. So you have to adjust that and refactor it some, and so on. Now, my colleagues shared that a large language model can do small data sets, basically create dummy data sets from the ground up with a lot of step-by-step instruction and building up of the related components. It would be nice to have much more capability in this area to have a large language model generate dummy data at scale, but we're just not quite there yet unless somebody knows of a tool that we haven't heard of yet. That may be coming, but this is something that as a developer advocate and as someone who works on databases and backend systems, this is something that is super vital to be able to showcase the technology. And yet it's probably the longest pole in the tent when we're pulling together applications or sample integrations and so on. is just finding a good, clean data set that works well. The content piece that I want to highlight this week is about the Neo4j data modeling MCP server. So yes, yet again, a little bit more MCP. I had come across this article actually several weeks ago, and finally, when I'm in the MCP world this week, took a few minutes of time and sat down and got through it. Alex Gilmore, who's from Neo4j, wrote this article as a way to outline kind of what the relatively new data modeling MCP server does and how it works. It's a way to interactively define a data model using a chat large language model interface in natural language. So say, hey, I have this data set. I want to construct something along these lines for a e-commerce data model or a cybersecurity data model. And the large language model can work with the MCP server and interactively put together something that is reasonably sensible. Now, of course, you can make some adjustments, and you can also export that model to a JSON file from the LLM interface and load that into a tool like Neo4j Arrows, for instance, where you can load in JSON and then it loads the model into a visual format, and then you can tweak that model and send it back. You can also then take that model that the Neo4j data modeling MCP server generates, and you can use that in conjunction with the Neo4j Cypher MCP server to actually load the data into the database. So the data modeling MCP server doesn't actually write to a database, but you can use it with one of our other MCP servers in order to do that step. The end of the article links to another one of Jason Koo's videos that interactively walks through these steps and shows you how it works. It's pretty cool, just the interaction between the chat interface and the data modeling side. It'll generate a visualization, and you can work with it back and forth to edit and tweak things. I know there is still some caution around MCP and some of the flaws that it brings to the table, but it is cool to see what the technology makes possible and the things that we can do with it. After starting the week with a few small tasks, several paths converged and put me into learning mode with MCP, or Model Context Protocol. I explored integrating some MCP servers with Claude for asking questions about data, and also caught up on an article about the recent release of the Neo4j data modeling MCP server. I'll keep you posted on where the journey takes me next. Thanks for listening, and happy coding.